It began with silence. Not the kind that follows a goodbye or the end of a story, but the chilling, breathless kind that creeps in when something isn't right. When the noise of the world suddenly fades, and your heart tells you something has broken, even if you don't know what yet. That's what Janeth Carina Muñoz Rivera's family felt in the summer of 1993, when the little girl vanished without warning, without a trace, and without a goodbye. One moment she was there, a child barely old enough to form full memories, and the next the world she belonged to had swallowed her whole. She was just a child, but her disappearance tore through the heart of her family like a storm with no forecast. There was no ransom note, no shadowy van pulling up on surveillance, no breaking news, just a hole in the world where a little girl should have been. And as the hours turned to days, and the days stretched into agonizing months, the whispers began. Was she taken? Was she hurt? Was she even still alive? The thing about cases like Janeth's is that the pain doesn't fade, it just settles deeper. Every holiday became a reminder. Every birthday candle blown out by her siblings felt like a betrayal of her absence. Every unknown knock at the door became a chance that maybe, just maybe, the nightmare was ending. But it never did. Not for 17 long years. By the time Janeth should have been graduating high school, her name was little more than a line on a forgotten missing poster. She wasn't a headline. She wasn't on TV. The world had moved on, but her family hadn't. Somewhere, her mother still folded the corner of her photograph into her wallet. Somewhere, someone still searched online forums and cold case files hoping for a spark. The question wasn't just where she had gone. It was why no one seemed to care anymore. But stories like this don't stay buried forever. Some truths rot in the dark, but others claw their way out, inch by inch, year by year, until they demand to be seen. And Janeth's truth, no matter how long it was hidden, was about to resurface. A truth no one saw coming, because behind the stillness of her absence was a life being lived. A girl, now a young woman, walking around in plain sight, not knowing she had once been a missing child. The case of Janeth Carina Muñoz Rivera isn't just about disappearance. It's about reinvention, deception, and the kind of quiet survival that lives beneath the surface of everyday life. This wasn't just a story of a child lost. It was a story of a childhood stolen, identities reshaped, and the long, painful unraveling of a lie that had lasted far too long. By the end of this, you'll see how someone can live a life built on secrets, how one twist of fate led to a miracle 17 years in the making, and how a single discovery shattered decades of silence. But for now, we go back to where it all began, not with sirens or screams, but with something far more haunting, just silence, and a girl who was never supposed to be seen again. The days after Janeth disappeared were a blur, not of chaos, but of devastating stillness. Her family moved like shadows in their own home, pacing through rooms that felt colder, now quieter, less alive. Toys were left untouched, clothes folded neatly in drawers, and her name, spoken only in whispers, echoed like a prayer, always unanswered. The world outside didn't stop, but inside the walls of her home, time had. They weren't living, they were waiting for a knock, a call, a clue, anything. Police investigations were launched, flyers were printed, questions were asked, but very quickly something more painful than grief crept in. Doubt, suspicion turned inward. Where had she gone? Who had seen her last? People started to ask the kinds of questions that hurt more than help. Was this really a kidnapping? Was it a runaway? Was someone in the family hiding something? No one wanted to believe that a child so young could vanish so cleanly, without a single trail. But that's exactly what happened. No cameras, no witnesses, no forced entry, no fingerprints. The case was like water slipping through fingers, impossible to hold onto, no matter how tight you gripped. And slowly, cruelly, the urgency of the investigation began to fade. Leads dried up, calls stopped coming, detectives were reassigned, and Janeth became just another name in a folder buried in a file cabinet marked unsolved. But while law enforcement moved on, her mother did not. She held on to that last memory, like a lifeline, the The way Janeth had looked at her the day before she vanished, the way her voice sounded when she said mommy, the scent of her hair after a bath, those small fragments, so personal and fragile, were all she had left. And every time she saw another child running through a park or tugging at their mother's hand in a grocery store, something inside her shattered all over again. Was that her? Could it be? What if Janeth had grown up only a few miles away, never knowing who she really was? Years passed, the world changed, technology advanced, new databases were created. DNA started cracking open cases that had been cold for decades. But Janeth's case remained sealed tight, not for lack of effort, but because no one even knew where to begin. You can't search for someone who doesn't know they're lost. Meanwhile, across the country, a young girl was growing up, with no idea that her life had begun with a lie. She had a name, a home, a family. She went to school, made friends, laughed, cried, and dreamed, just like every other child. To her, everything felt normal. Her life made sense, but that was the cruelest twist of all, because it wasn't hers. The people who raised her had created a perfect illusion, one that even she believed, and yet something must have always felt slightly off, a question she couldn't quite ask, a silence she didn't know how to fill. Somewhere inside her was a truth buried so deep, even she couldn't feel it. Not yet. 17 years is a long time to live in a false reality. Long enough to forget what was taken, long enough to believe that the world you're in is the one you were meant to have, but not long enough to outrun the truth forever, because eventually, all lies crack, all secrets surface, and all missing pieces find their way back to the people who never stopped looking. It wasn't supposed to happen that day. There was nothing special about it. No strange phone call, no unexpected visitor, just another ordinary moment in the life of a young woman who thought she knew exactly who she was. She was 17. She had dreams, responsibilities, a favorite teacher, a best friend, but beneath that familiar skin, a storm was brewing, one she couldn't see, one she never asked for, because somewhere in a government database, a quiet red flag had just been triggered, and the truth, long buried beneath years of silence, had finally started to claw its way out. It began with paperwork, a minor inconsistency, something small, so small it should have gone unnoticed. But it didn't, not this time. An investigator, assigned to something completely unrelated, came across a detail that didn't sit right, a name that didn't match a birth certificate, a timeline that didn't align with medical records. A series of puzzle pieces that had no reason to fit, unless you were looking from a completely different angle, and someone did. A fingerprint database, a missing child alert, cold case file, so old it had been digitally archived, and nearly forgotten. 17 years is a lifetime, long enough for systems to change, records to be lost, and memories to fade, but not this time. Somehow, the name Janeth Carina Muñoz Rivera surfaced, a name that meant nothing to the girl living in California, under a completely different identity, and yet it was hers. Authorities moved carefully, quietly. There was no room for error. You don't storm in guns blazing when you suspect that the person you're looking for doesn't even know she's missing. So they waited, watched, cross-referenced. They wanted to be absolutely sure. Because if what they were seeing was real, it meant a child stolen, in the early 90s, had been hiding in plain sight for nearly 2 decades. The knock finally came. She didn't understand it at first. The officers were kind, respectful, not accusatory. But they asked questions that didn't make sense. Questions about her birth, her early years, people she didn't remember, names she didn't know, faces she'd never seen. It felt surreal, like she had stepped into a movie script she didn't audition for. Then they said the words, "You were reported missing." The silence that followed was heavier than any scream. Her world didn't just crack, it collapsed. Everything she thought she knew was up for question. Who were her parents? Why had no one told her? Was her whole life a lie? She sat there, frozen in a storm of thoughts that didn't belong to her. She didn't feel like a victim, not yet, but something had been taken from her, something she hadn't even known was hers to begin with. And now that absence echoed louder than anything else in the room. She was Janeth. She always had been, but she didn't remember being her. As authorities continued their investigation, what they uncovered was heartbreaking, not because of blood or violence, but because of the quiet devastation left behind by a stolen identity. The person who had taken her had built a world so carefully, so seamlessly, that it took nearly 2 decades and a twist of administrative luck to expose the truth. And her family, the one who had searched for her, they had waited 17 birthdays, 17 Christmases, 17 endless years with no answers. And now somewhere out there, they would learn that the child they buried in their hearts was alive, breathing, safe, changed. But a reunion wasn't as simple as a phone call, because how do you tell a girl that her life is a lie, and that the people she belongs to are strangers? How do you rebuild something that was never allowed to grow? How do you return a child when the child no longer remembers what she was taken from? The answer, like everything else in this story, wasn't easy. It was layered, complicated, and painfully human. This wasn't just about a missing person. It was about fractured identities, stolen years, lost trust, and 2 versions of reality colliding after far too much time apart. What came next would test everything: love, forgiveness, memory, and truth. Because reunions aren't always joyful. Sometimes they're raw, messy, confused, and they don't always have happy endings, but they matter. And for Janeth Carina Muñoz Rivera, her story was far from over. Years passed, the world changed, technology advanced, new databases were created. DNA started cracking open cases that had been cold for decades, but Janeth's case remained sealed tight, not for lack of effort, but because no one even knew where to begin. You can't search for someone who doesn't know they're lost. Meanwhile, across the country, a young girl was growing up with no idea that her life had begun with a lie. She had a name, a home, a family. She went to school, made friends, laughed, cried, and dreamed, just like every other child. To her, everything felt normal. Her life made sense, but that was the cruelest twist of all, because it wasn't hers. The people who raised her had created a perfect illusion, one that even she believed. And yet something must have always felt slightly off, a question she couldn't quite ask, a silence she didn't know how to fill. Somewhere inside her was a truth buried so deep, even she couldn't feel it. Not yet. 17 years is a long time to live in a false reality, long enough to forget what was taken, long enough to believe that the world you're in is the one you were meant to have, but not long enough to outrun the truth forever, because eventually, all lies crack, all secrets surface, and all missing pieces find their way back to the people who never stopped looking. The call was short, just a few words, a name, a confirmation, and then a silence so deep, it swallowed the room whole. 17 years. That's how long her mother had waited for this moment, though in truth, she had stopped believing it would ever come. You can only replay your child's final steps so many times before the film inside your mind burns out from exhaustion. You imagine her being taken. You imagine her being lost. You imagine her being hurt. And eventually, you imagine her gone, because hope becomes a dangerous weight to carry. But now there was a voice on the other end of the line saying the words no mother ever expects to hear after nearly 2 decades. She's alive. The next moments unfolded in a haze, tears, screams, collapsing to her knees, saying her daughter's name out loud for the first time in years, as if it were a spell that might shatter the reality. Could it really be? Could her baby, now a young woman, truly be found? And yet beneath the joy, something else took root, a strange, quiet terror, because this wasn't going to be a fairy tale reunion. This wasn't going to be a hug at the airport with cameras flashing and violins swelling. No, this was going to be different, because Janeth didn't remember her. She had been a toddler when she vanished, too young to hold on to faces, too young to know the shape of her own history. And now she belonged to two lives, one that had been stolen, and one that had been constructed. Which was more real? Authorities coordinated carefully. They prepared both sides for the shock, for the disconnect, for the confusion that would inevitably cloud what should have been the happiest moment of their lives. It wasn't just about locating Janeth. It was about navigating the minefield that lay between then and now. When the meeting finally happened, it was quiet. No press, no flashing bulbs. Just a plain room, 2 chairs, and the air thick with emotions neither of them had words for. She walked in slowly, hesitantly, her eyes scanning the woman in front of her, not recognizing her but feeling something strange. A pull, a weight. Like some part of her subconscious had reached forward from the past, trying to remind her of something that was stolen before she could form words. Her mother stood frozen, hands shaking. She didn't reach out, didn't want to scare her, because this wasn't a child coming home. This was a stranger, one who bore her daughter's eyes, but not her memories. Janeth spoke first, barely above a whisper. "I'm sorry." Her mother's knees buckled, not because of the words, but because of how they were said, like a girl apologizing for something she didn't understand. A girl asking forgiveness for surviving. And that's the tragedy most people never consider. When a missing child is found alive, the world cheers, but no one talks about what happens after the headlines fade, about how love doesn't erase time, about how trauma lingers in the silence between two people who should know each other but don't. Janeth didn't run into her mother's arms. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She sat there rigid, polite, overwhelmed, because to her this woman wasn't mom. She was someone new, and to her mother Janeth was both everything she'd been waiting for, and a stranger wearing her child's skin. There were questions, but answers didn't come easily. Where had she been taken? Why? Who raised her? Did she ever suspect the truth? Janeth had only fragments, flashes, feelings. She remembered different names, different birthdays, different rules. The woman who raised her wasn't cruel, but she wasn't honest either. And now every memory she thought was safe had been cracked open, exposed to doubt. Was she loved? Yes. Was she lied to? Also yes. That duality broke her. And then came the hardest question of all. What now? The law had stepped in. Custody was reviewed. Counseling was recommended. But no court could restore what had been lost. No policy could mend 17 years of separate lives. They couldn't just go back. There was no before to return to, so they had to build something new, slowly, carefully. Letters, photos, long phone calls, visits filled with awkward silences and nervous laughter. They tried to find common ground, shared tastes, quirks, smiles, and sometimes it worked. Sometimes Janeth caught herself laughing like her mother. Sometimes her mother spotted a familiar gesture in Janeth's hands. Little moments, small bridges. Proof that even in separation, blood leaves fingerprints. But trauma doesn't follow a script, and the road wasn't smooth. There were breakdowns, retreats, periods of silence that lasted weeks, because healing isn't linear, and not every reunion comes with closure. Some wounds don't scar, they stay open. Still, they tried, because for all the time stolen, they still had this one gift: each other. Even if the past had been rewritten, even if the future was uncertain, they had now. And in a world where most missing children are never found, now was everything. You would think the hardest part was over, that after 17 years, once Janeth Carina Muñoz Rivera was found alive and reunited with her biological mother, the world would quietly right itself again, that the clock would somehow reset, that a fractured life would stitch itself back together, page by page, memory by memory. But that's not how these stories end. In fact, the hardest part had only just begun, because after the embrace, after the tears, after the reporters walked away, and the court records were filed, what remained was a young woman holding two truths that could never coexist. One, she was taken. Two, she was raised. Both were real. Both defined her, but they didn't match. And that's the thing no one talks about in these long-lost stories, the limbo. Janeth wasn't just a girl found. She was a life built on borrowed time, raised with a name that wasn't hers, loved by someone who wasn't her mother, told a story that wasn't true, but felt like it was. So what happens when your real life finds you? When strangers start calling you daughter? When someone else's grief becomes your inheritance? When you're handed a new name, a new history, a family tree you never climbed, and you're expected to feel everything they've been aching for? Janeth struggled. Who wouldn't? Therapists called it identity shock, the emotional whiplash of waking up to realize your entire life has been footnoted by a lie. Some days, she clung to the memories she'd grown up with, birthdays, inside jokes, the rhythm of the life she thought was hers. On other days, she opened photo albums from a family she never remembered, wondering what it would have felt like to be held by that woman, kissed goodnight in that house, protected by that name. She wasn't angry, not really, but she was lost, because the world around her was celebrating a miracle. A missing child had come home. Headlines wrote it like a triumph, a blessing, a victory. But Janeth didn't feel like a miracle. She felt like a question mark. And that's the heartbreaking reality. Being found doesn't erase being lost. It doesn't cancel the damage done by years in the dark. It doesn't undo the isolation, the confusion, the invisible wall that stands between the person you were told you were and the person you really are. Still, in that in-between space, that no man's land of memory and identity, she began to build, not rebuild, not return, but build. Slowly, painfully, she learned to hold both stories in her hands. She wasn't just the girl who vanished in 1993. She wasn't just the woman raised under another name. She was both, and neither, and something entirely new. Her mother, too, learned to navigate this emotional terrain. She had to let go of the fantasy reunion. She had to love the woman standing in front of her, not the baby she lost. She had to grieve a childhood missed, and still find joy in every awkward step forward. They didn't become a family overnight. Maybe they never quite would, but they became something else, something just as sacred. They became survivors of loss, of time, of silence, of identity theft, in the most literal sense. And in a world that rarely gives back what it takes, that survival was a kind of miracle all its own. So what do we take away from a story like this? We learn that disappearance doesn't always mean death, that hope, even when buried under decades of grief, can flicker back to life. That identity is more than names or documents. It's the quiet journey of understanding who you are when the truth finally finds you. And we learn that found isn't a final chapter. It's just a new beginning. If this story moved you, if it made you think, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, or tell us if you know another case that deserves to be told. Subscribe for more true stories of missing people who were found alive, stories that remind us how powerful truth can be, even after decades of silence. And remember, every missing person has a story, and every story deserves to be heard.